Chapter 3: The Discovery of the Gold Coast by Europeans. The earliest European discoveries on the Gold Coast, of which there are now any complete records, are those made by the Portuguese. They first reached the coast in 1471 and in 1482 began to form settlements, in which they remained for a period of 160 years. It is by no means certain, however, that they were actually the first European nation on the scene. The French claim to have discovered the Gold Coast in 1346, over a century before the arrival of the Portuguese, and to have established and maintained a regular trade for many years. This claim of the French is most indignantly denied by the Portuguese and as stoutly supported by themselves. It is true that there is a certain amount of evidence in their favour, but it is of rather doubtful value. Consequently, the truth of this French claim has not been generally admitted. The Portuguese discoveries, on the other hand, are thoroughly substantiated, and there is no doubt that whether preceded by the French or not, they were made independently. It is to them, therefore, that the credit of having been the European pioneers of the Gold Coast is usually given, and their discoveries will be dealt with first, and the claims of the French considered later. The progress of Portuguese discovery along the western coast of Africa was gradual and stimulated from time to time by various successes. Many years elapsed before the Gold Coast itself was reached, and its discovery was in reality only an incident in a long sequence of events. These will, therefore, be outlined in order to show what were the objects for which these explorations were undertaken, and how it was that the Portuguese were encouraged to persevere for so long. The discoveries of the Portuguese were primarily due to the enterprise and ambition of Prince Henry the Navigator. He was the fifth child and fourth son of John I of Portugal and Philippa, daughter of John of Gaunt. On his mother's side, therefore, he was English and a nephew of Henry IV and great-grandson of Edward III. Until the year 1412, the Portuguese had never passed beyond Cape Non, but in this year Prince Henry sent a small ship to explore the coast, and another was dispatched a little later. Cape Non was then passed and the coast explored as far as Cape Bojador. But when they reached this point, the Portuguese were so alarmed by the strong currents and tremendous surf that they found there, that they were afraid to venture beyond it, and maintained that they had now reached the limit of practicable navigation. In 1415, Prince Henry accompanied his father to Ceuta, in the conquest of which he greatly distinguished himself, and was created Duke of Viseu. Remaining some time in Africa, he collected all the information he could from the Moors, and it was then that he learned for the first time of the existence beyond the Sahara Desert of a rich and fertile inhabited land where both gold and ivory were obtainable. This, he was told, could be approached either by land or sea. The Mohammedans at this time had several states on the Niger, and were well acquainted with the Jollof country and Timbuktu. It was the account of their trade with these regions, the very existence of which had hitherto been unsuspected, that fired the prince with the strongest desire to reach them. But this was not the only object of the explorations to which he devoted the remainder of his life. He was anxious to discover, if possible, a southern route to India, in order to obtain for Portugal a portion of the valuable trade carried on by the Arabs and their Venetian agents, which had first been founded by Alexander and Nearchus. Prince Henry was moreover a very pious man, and Grand Master of the Order of Christ. He believed in the now abandoned dogma that no heathen could be saved, and the propagation of the Christian faith and the discovery of the kingdom of Prester John also formed part of his schemes. This rather mysterious person was said to rule over a Christian people. He had been sought in vain in Asia, and it was now believed that this kingdom must be somewhere in Africa. At the present time, this kingdom of Prester John is identified with Abyssinia, whose kings traced their descent from the son of the Queen of Sheba by Solomon. Prince Henry, though only 21, now retired from the court and went to live on Cape St. Vincent, where the town of Sagres was built. It was a bleak and desolate spot, where a few junipers were the only plants that could survive the continual drenchings of spray from the waves that dashed against the foot of the cliff. The view of the wide expanse of ocean constantly inspired his thoughts and encouraged him to persevere. Here he established his dockyards and collected the most skillful navigators, the best shipwrights, and the most learned scientific men of his day. And from here he watched his vessels sail from the neighboring port of Lagos with the cross of his order painted on their sails, and patiently waited to catch the first glimpse of them as they returned from the unknown seas they had been sent to explore. In 1418, Prince Henry sent two naval officers of his household, João Gonçalves Zarco and Tristam Vaz Teixeira, in a small ship to try and pass Cape Bojador. Before they reached the cape, a heavy gale sprang up and blew their ship out to sea. In this helpless condition, having lost sight of their familiar landmarks, they had given themselves up for lost when they suddenly saw an island ahead, under the lee of which they cast anchor. This was one of the Madeira group, which they named Porto Santo. Hitherto the Portuguese had never done more than coast along within sight of land, but this accident had demonstrated the possibility of navigating the open sea, and when they returned and reported their discovery, they were sent back in the same year with one Bartholomew Perestrello to colonize the island. Prince Henry now met with great opposition from many sections of his own countrymen, who, for reasons of their own, were averse to the further extension of these discoveries. The nobility were afraid the wealth obtained by others from these new lands might weaken their own power and dignity, and the learned men dreaded having their long-cherished theories upset by newly discovered facts. The clergy seemed to have thought the expenditure of a part of the funds of the Order of Christ on the problematical conversion of heathens who had yet to be discovered was hardly justifiable, and the jealousy of the military was aroused by the sight of honours being won by a profession they had always been accustomed to look down upon. There were many ignorant and superstitious persons, too, who loudly proclaimed that it was vain presumption to attempt to discover a passage round the southern extremity of Africa, which the best and wisest of the older geographers had always thought was impossible. They declared that any Portuguese who were rash enough to pass Cape Bojador would be turned into blacks and bear this lasting brand of their folly. These absurd predictions had such an effect on public opinion that Prince Henry found it impossible to obtain crews to man his ships. But he was not a man to be easily turned from his purpose, and the success he had already achieved in the discovery of Porto Santo made him determined to persevere. About 1430, therefore, he sent Ferdinand Lopez d'Azevedo to Pope Martin V to point out the advantages that might accrue to the Church if his discoveries were extended. He succeeded so well in this mission that the Pope granted a bull confirming the Portuguese in their possession not only of the islands that they had already discovered, but of any lands that might be acquired by future expeditions also. He then silenced the objectors by blessing the naval profession and granting plenary indulgence to all those who might lose their lives in these attempts. These concessions were subsequently confirmed and extended by Popes Eugene IV, Nicholas V, and Sextus IV. In 1433, Julianus succeeded in doubling Cape Bojador and then returned and reported that contrary to general opinion, there was nothing to prevent the seas beyond that point being navigated. Accordingly, in the following year, he was sent out to continue his discoveries, and with him, in a larger ship, went Alfonso Gonzalez Baldaya, the prince's cupbearer. They reached a point 90 miles beyond Cape Bojador, where on landing they found the trail of a caravan and then returned. They gave the name Angra dos Rivos, or Bay of Gurnets, to the bay in which they had anchored, on account of the number of those fish that the seamen had caught. The next year, 1435, these same two men were sent out again and ordered to prolong their voyage until they met with some of the inhabitants of these new countries. They sailed another 40 miles beyond the Angra dos Rivos, but saw no signs of any people. They therefore landed two of their number, Hector Homan and Diego Lopez d'Almeida, with horses. Neither of these youths was yet 16, but they rode boldly inland to explore. Each was provided with a spear and sword, but they were not allowed armor, lest they should be tempted to engage the natives if they met any. It was not until late in the day, after they had ridden many miles, that they espied 19 natives all armed with spears, who, on their approach, fled and hid themselves in a cave, from which they found it impossible to dislodge them. The two adventurers, therefore, returned to their ship for assistance, and a party was quickly organized, which set out for the cave. But when they reached it, they found that the people had already fled. In commemoration of this excursion, the bay in which they had landed was named Angra dos Cavallos, or the Bay of Horses. Later, they reached Punto da Gale, where they found a fishing net, but could see no other sign of any inhabitants, and then returned to Portugal. During this voyage, Julianus had obtained some seal skins, and in 1441 Antonio Gonzalez was sent out to continue the exploration of the coast and get a further supply of these skins. Having shipped his cargo, this enterprising man took 9 of his crew and marched inland by night. After they had gone about 10 miles, they saw a man armed with 2 spears following a camel and easily secured him, for he was too astonished by the sudden apparition of white men to attempt to escape. On their way back to the ship with their captive, they fell in with a party of 40 men and a woman, having separated the latter from her companions, secured her also. The next day, while they were getting ready to leave, Nuno Tristan arrived in another ship, and a second excursion was at once planned for the following night. They had not gone far when they again fell in with the natives, and after a struggle in the darkness, in which 3 of the Africans were killed, succeeded in taking 10 more prisoners. They were taken on board, where it was found that an Arab who formed one of the crew was able to understand their language. He was accordingly put on shore with the woman to arrange for the redemption of the others. The Africans were naturally enraged by these captures and the loss of the men who had been killed in the affray overnight, and though they came down to the beach in great numbers and beckoned to the Portuguese to come on shore and treat with them, the Arab called out, warning them that if they landed they would certainly be attacked. They therefore lay off in their boats, and the people, after throwing volleys of stones at them, went away. Gonzalez then returned to Portugal with his prisoners, and Nuno Tristan, having first careened his ship, continued his voyage down the coast and succeeded in reaching Cape Blanco about 360 miles beyond Cape Bojador. But though he again found fishing nets on the beach, he could see nothing of any inhabitants. The prisoners taken on this expedition were well treated, and when it was found that 3 of them were men of some importance in their country and willing to pay liberally for their release, it was decided to send them back, for the prince believed that the accounts they would give of the good treatment they had received at the hands of the Portuguese would do much to remove the ill feeling of the people towards his sailors and materially simplify their future labours. In 1442, therefore, Gonzalez returned with the 3 principal Moors, and on reaching the coast landed the chief one. He, however, no sooner found himself free again than he forgot all his promises and disappeared as quickly as he could without paying the ransom, for which he certainly cannot be blamed. But he seems to have reported the arrival of the others, for 9 days later about 100 of their people came to redeem them. They were given up in exchange for 10 negroes from different countries, some gold dust, a few ostrich eggs, and a buckskin shield. This gold dust was the first that had been seen, and the estuary in which it was obtained was named the Rio del Oro, or the River of Gold. It is difficult to overestimate the effect it had in inflaming the zeal of the Portuguese for further discoveries and silencing their detractors, for the sight of it opened up such vast possibilities of an extensive and highly profitable trade that there was no longer any fear that these explorations would be abandoned. Had Prince Henry died before this gold was obtained to prove the truth of his theories, it is doubtful if any further voyages would have been made, for he was still generally regarded as a visionary, and it was due to his personal influence and determination alone that they had not been given up long before. In 1443, Nuno Tristan doubled Cape Blanco and reached the island of Arguin, where he captured 14 more natives. These seizures of natives by Gonzalez and Nuno Tristan constituted the foundation of the African slave trade, for from that time forward it became customary for the captain of every vessel that passed down the West African coast to carry off a few of the people in this way. Though it was not until the commencement of the 16th century that this trade began to take definite shape, it was then very quickly established and eventually assumed such proportions that it overshadowed everything else, and for many years afterwards maintained its position as one of the greatest curses ever introduced into Africa. It was a custom, however, which was not peculiar to the Portuguese, nor did they originate it. Slavery, in one form or another, had existed from the remotest times, not only in Africa, but also among the Jews, Greeks, Phoenicians, and in fact every ancient race. During the Roman occupation of Britain, great numbers of the people were carried away into slavery to add luster to the triumphal processions of their generals, or to be done to death at their festival games. About this time, some merchants of Lagos, now fully alive to the importance of the prince's schemes and the value of the trade that might be expected to result from his discoveries, projected a chartered company. The prince granted their request, and the first East India Company was formed by Lanzarote, Juan Diaz Gillanes, Estevan Alfonso, and Rodrigo Alvarez. In 1444, this company, under the sanction of the prince, sent out a fleet of 6 caravels under Lanzarote, who reached the island of Nar near Arguin. There he assaulted a village and captured not fewer than 155 natives, afterwards taking 40 more from some other islands nearby. It is said that the object of the Portuguese in taking these prisoners was to obtain reliable information about their countries, but that the prince had ordered all his captains to treat the people at all times with kindness and humanity, and not to take more men than were necessary for this purpose. It is evident, however, that these moderate instructions were grossly exceeded by his officers, who had only themselves to thank for the unfortunate events that occurred a little later. It is but natural that such high-handed proceedings should have been resented by the natives and have incensed them against the Portuguese, and in the following year Gonzales da Sintra was betrayed by an Arab interpreter at Algerine, and he and 7 of his men murdered, while 5 others only saved their lives by swimming off to the ship. Prince Henry, therefore, sent 3 ships in 1446 under Antonio Gonzalez, Diego Alfonso, and Gomez Perez, with strict orders to use every possible means to cultivate the friendship of the people and remove their suspicions and ill will. In this they met with little or no success, but on their return, Juan Fernandez was left behind at his own request. By living among the people for a time, he hoped to gain much information about the country and to win their confidence. This intrepid man, after suffering the severest hardships and living with the people as a slave, at length gained the friendship of an aged Moor named Juade Maimon, who treated him with some consideration. He was rescued about 8 months later by Antonio Gonzalez, and several of the prisoners previously taken by the Portuguese were ransomed at the same time. This voyage was very successful, and Gonzalez returned with a considerable quantity of gold dust, besides 90 Negroes obtained from various places. In 1446, Denis Fernandez sailed past the mouth of the Senegal River, near which he captured 4 natives in a canoe, and reached and named Cape Verde before turning back. Many minor voyages were made during this period, and in 1447 Nuno Tristan, sailing past Cape Verde, reached the Rio Grande, which he entered and began to explore in one of his ship's boats. He took 22 of his crew with him, but after they had gone some distance up the river, they were suddenly attacked by 80 natives in canoes. They had doubtless heard of the kidnapping propensities of the white men, and at once poured in a flight of poisoned arrows, killing or wounding every man. Tristan himself and 2 or 3 others were the only occupants of the boat who were still alive when she drifted down to the ship, and they too died soon after being taken on board. Only 4 men out of the ship's whole crew were now left to sail her home, but after experiencing the greatest difficulties, they eventually succeeded in reaching Portugal. In this same year, 1446, Alvaro Fernandez sailed 40 leagues beyond the Rio Grande, when he too was wounded by the poisoned arrows of the natives, but, being possessed of an antidote, recovered and returned in safety to Portugal, where he received 100 gold ducats each from the regent Dom Pedro and Prince Henry as a special mark of their gratitude. After many other voyages of no special importance, the first 2 voyages of the celebrated Genoese Alonso de Cada Mosto in 1455 and 1456, Pedro da Sintra sailed with 2 armed ships in 1462 and discovered and named Sierra Leone, after which he sailed on and explored the coast as far as Cape Mencerado. Before da Sintra's return, Prince Henry had died in 1463 in his 67th year. The death of this illustrious prince, the founder and moving spirit of European discovery in West Africa, put a stop for a time to further explorations of an organized character. His had been undertaken as a national work, but the only voyages that were made during the next few years were those of private traders and adventurers. Though the records of his discoveries only extend them to the neighborhood of Sierra Leone, there is some reason to believe that some of the expeditions he sent out went much farther and even penetrated south of the line. But whether the absence of records is due to loss or to the fact that the explorers were wrecked and could not return to report the extent of their travels is doubtful. The latter, however, seems to be the most probable explanation. In 1525, Garcia de Loaisa, Knight of Malta, visited the island of San Tome with a Spanish fleet. He found it uninhabited, but saw distinct traces of its former occupation by the Portuguese. Besides many fruits and tame cattle, he discovered an inscription carved on a tree, as was the Portuguese custom, setting forth that they had been there 87 years earlier, that is, in the year 1438, 25 years before the death of Prince Henry, whose motto, Talent de bien faire, was also carved upon the tree. In 1469, King Alfonso V farmed out the Guinea trade to Fernando Gomez for an annual rent of 500 ducats, equivalent to £138, and an undertaking that he would extend the discovery of the coast 500 leagues farther south. Few details remain of the voyages made during this period, but in 1471, Juan de Santarem and Pedro d'Escobar discovered the trade of oro de la mina, or the gold of the mine, somewhere in the neighborhood of El Mina or Shama. This is the first authentic record of Portuguese discovery on the Gold Coast. Fernando Gomez also opened a gold mine at Abrobi, near Comenda. There was now a regularly established gold trade, and large quantities were imported annually from Elmina and Shama, a treaty of commerce having been concluded with the chief of the former place. When his contract expired in 1474, Fernando Gomez was given the surname Mina by the king and granted a coat of arms argent, 3 negroes' head collared or with rings in their noses and ears, in recognition of his discoveries. In 1481, John II ascended the throne of Portugal, and being thoroughly conversant with the Guinea trade, and appreciating to the full the great importance of the work done and progress made by Fernando Gomez, decided not to rely on the papal bull alone, but to build a fort on the Gold Coast, to protect the trade from the avarice of other nations and safeguard the interests of Portugal. Accordingly, a fleet of 10 caravels and 2 transports was made ready and loaded with all the materials necessary for the erection of a fortress and church, which were to be built at the place found most convenient for protecting the gold trade. The equipment was remarkably complete. Everything was provided from the ready-dressed stones for the foundation to the tiles for the roof and provisions for 600 men. The command of this fleet was given to Don Diego d'Azambuja, under whom were the following officers commanding caravels: Gonzales da Fonseca, Rui d'Oliveira, Juan Rodriguez Gante, Juan Alfonso, Diego Rodriguez Ingles, Bartolomeu Diaz, Pedro Devora, and Gomez Ayres. Of these, the last was an attendant on Pedro, King of Aragon, but all the others were officers of the king's household. The 2 transports were commanded by Pedro da Sintra and Fernan d'Alfonso, and a smaller vessel went with them as a dispatch boat to the squadron. They had 500 officers and soldiers and 100 masons and other workmen aboard. This fleet sailed on the 11th of December, 1481, and anchored off Elmina on the 19th of January, 1482. There they found a Portuguese trader named Juan Bernardo, who had come to the coast for gold and had some knowledge of the people and their language. He was therefore taken as interpreter and sent to notify the chief of the arrival of the expedition. He was told to arrange a meeting as early as possible, and particularly to impress upon the chief the high rank and importance of the visitors. Early the next morning, January 20, the party landed, carrying their arms concealed under their coats, and walked towards the spot they had chosen as most suitable for the erection of the fortress. There they hoisted the royal standard of Portugal on a high tree, beneath which they built an altar. Mass was then said, and prayers were offered for the success of their plans, the conversion of the Africans, and the endurance of the church they were about to found. Everyone was splendidly dressed in order to make the greatest possible impression. Dazambuja wore a gold brocaded waistcoat and a richly ornamented gold collar set with jewels, and all his companions were clothed in silks. The chief was now expected, and so Dazambuja seated himself on a raised chair and disposed his followers in 2 lines before him, so that they formed an avenue up which the Alminas would have to pass. The chief, whose name is given as Caramansa, probably a corruption of Kwamin Ansa, now approached with his retinue. They wore monkey skins or palm leaves hanging from the waist, but were otherwise naked. Their arms consisted of spears, shields, and bows and arrows, and on their heads were helmets made of skins and thickly studded with sharks' teeth. The chief, who was preceded by his hornblowers and drummers, wore plates and other ornaments of gold on his arms and legs, and a heavy gold chain around his neck, while his hair and beard, as well as those of his subordinate chiefs, were ornamented with small golden bells and other trinkets. The lesser chiefs also wore gold chains around their necks, and each one was accompanied by 2 attendants, one of whom carried his stool and the other his shield. After an interchange of salutations and compliments, Dazambuja, through his interpreter, explained the object of his visit. He used every specious argument he could think of to convince the chief of the advantages he and his people would derive from the friendship and local protection of so powerful a monarch as the King of Portugal, and while carefully concealing all anxiety and covetousness on his own side, laid special stress on the fact that the king's chief wish was to instruct the people in the Christian religion. Finally, he asked Ansa's permission to establish themselves in his town and build a house, saying that though Baya, the chief of Shama, and several others would think it an honor to have such a house built on their lands, yet the king had selected Elmina because he had been moved by Ansa's previous kindnesses to his people and wished to honor him alone. This speech was listened to with great attention by the Elminas, and when it was finished, Ansa sat silent for some minutes, considering the whole subject and weighing the arguments that had been advanced by Dazambuja in support of his request. He raised no objection to anything but the suggested formation of a settlement, a project which he evidently viewed with suspicion and distrust. His guarded reply plainly shows that even in those early days, the African chief was as skilled a diplomatist as those of the more recent times have so often proved themselves. "I am not insensible," said he, "to the high honor which your great master, the chief of Portugal, has this day conferred upon me. His friendship I have always endeavored to merit by the strictness of my dealing with the Portuguese, but by my constant exertions to procure an immediate lading for their vessels. But never until this day did I observe such a difference in the appearance of his subjects. They have hitherto been only meanly attired, were easily contented with the commodities they received, and so far from wishing to continue in this country, were never happy until they could complete their lading, and return. Now I remark a strange difference. A great number, richly dressed, are anxious to be allowed to build houses and to continue among us. Men of such eminence, conducted by a commander who from his own account seems to have descended from the God who made day and night, and can never bring themselves to endure the hardships of this climate, nor would they here be able to procure any of the luxuries that abound in their own country. The passions that are common to us all will therefore inevitably bring on disputes, and it is far preferable that both our nations should continue on the same footing they have hitherto done, allowing your ships to come and go as usual. The desire of seeing each other occasionally will preserve peace between us. The sea and land, being always neighbours, are continually at variance, and contending who shall give way. The sea with great violence attempting to subdue the land, and the land with equal obstinacy resolving to oppose the sea. This skilful evasion of the principal, if not the sole object of their mission, considerably disconcerted the Portuguese, and it required all the address of Dazambuja, backed by presents and promises and veiled threats, that if permission were withheld, it might possibly be dispensed with, to induce the chief to give a reluctant consent. His unwillingness was probably due in part to previous misunderstandings and quarrels with some of the Portuguese sailors, and to a belief commonly held by the Africans that Europeans were a people who had no land of their own, but were compelled to wander about the seas in ships until some fortunate chance enabled them to settle themselves in the country of some other people. Whatever his real reasons may have been, there can be no doubt that Anser looked forward to the continual presence of the Portuguese with anything but enthusiasm, and had a pretty clear perception of his own interests. However, his consent once given, Dazambuja lost no time in commencing operations, and Anser as soon saw his misgivings justified. The very next morning, January 21st, the workmen were landed and preparations at once made for the laying of the foundations of the fortress. Seeing a large rock close at hand and convenient for their purpose, the Portuguese were able to begin quarrying it, when they were suddenly attacked by the Elminas, who believed it to be the residence of the god of the river Benya. Dazambuja ran towards them and managed to pacify them with presents and apologies, but not before many of his men had been wounded. This misfortune, however, was not allowed to delay the building of the fort, and the work was pushed on to such good purpose that in 20 days the tower had been raised to the first story, and the whole building was already sufficiently advanced to be capable of easy defense. This rapid progress had been made possible by the prepared materials that had been brought out for the tower, which only required fitting together. This is the tower which stands just beyond the drawbridge at the main entrance to the castle at the present time. As soon as the building was finished, Dazambuja sent back the fleet with a large quantity of gold, while he himself remained at Elmina with a garrison of 60 men as its first governor, a position which he filled with credit for 2 years and 7 months. The fort was named the Castle of San Jorge, and in 1486 King John conferred upon it all the rights and privileges of a city, and an annual solemn mass was ordered to be said in its church for the repose of the soul of Prince Henry, to whose efforts the Portuguese owed their possessions in West Africa. At the same time, the king added to his other titles that of Lord of Guinea. The site of the castle was well chosen. It stands upon a rock forming the point of a peninsula, and is surrounded on 2 sides by the sea, and on the third by a lagoon known as the river Benya, which runs inland for some distance almost parallel to the sea. The castle, therefore, can only be approached by land on its western side. Such is the account given by the Portuguese historians of the formation of the first settlement at Elmina. But although this is the one that is most generally accepted, it is not, as has been mentioned already, the only one, and the claim to priority of discovery which has been advanced by the French must now be considered. That the French traded to the Gold Coast shortly after the Portuguese settled at Elmina, there is abundant evidence to prove, and the Portuguese themselves admit it. But the question now at issue is whether or not they were there in the 14th century, long before the date of the Portuguese discoveries, and even before the time of Prince Henry himself. This claim has been advanced by Villot, Sieur de Bellefonte, who made a voyage to the Gold Coast in 1666 and 1667, and by the geographer Robb, whom Ogilby and others have copied. Their several accounts are in general agreement. Villot says that in the year 1346, certain adventurers of Dieppe, who were accustomed to make long voyages, a circumstance which he attributes to their Norman descent, sailed down the west coast of Africa and established settlements at various places, especially in the neighborhood of Cape Verde, where they named a bay the Bay of France, giving the names Petit Dieppe and Castro Paris to Rio Corso and Grand Cesse respectively. He says that they brought large quantities of ivory back with them, and it was at this time that the ivory turning and comb making industry, for which Dieppe afterwards became famous, was first established. He goes on to say that the castle of Mina, or Elmina, was founded by the French in 1383, and that they held it until 1484, but that during the time of the civil wars in France from 1380 to 1461, this trade became so disorganized that the settlements were first neglected and ultimately abandoned. Robbie's account is that in 1364, the merchants of Dieppe made several voyages to Cape Verde and Castro Paris, and in 1382 combined with the merchants of Rouen to send 3 ships on a voyage of discovery beyond these places. One of these, La Vierge, arrived at Comenda on the Gold Coast, and afterwards sailed on to Elmina. He agrees with Villot that it was in the following year, 1383, that a fort or factory was built at this place and garrisoned by 10 or 12 men. The trade prospered, and in 1387 a chapel was also built. This trade was carried on until 1413, when it was finally abandoned owing to the civil wars in France. Such are the statements of these 2 authors, who unfortunately give very little information as to the grounds upon which they base their assertions. They say, however, that there still existed in Elmina Castle a battery, the principal battery towards the sea, known as the Bastion de France, and that a stone in it bore an inscription, of which all that was legible was Anno 13. This, they allege, referred to the date 1383, when the place was built by the French. As further evidence in support of their claim, they mention the existence of places with French names and some knowledge of the language by the natives, who they say used a few words derived from it. The French are further said to have had settlements at Axim, Cape Coast, Cormantin, Comenda, Accra, and Takoradi. Barbeau, who was Agent General of the French African Company in 1682, in discussing this question, decides against the French claim on the following grounds. If this account be true, it is strange that no mention is made of it by other French historians, several of whom I have examined, and particularly Desserres and Mézeray. Such considerable undertakings and so rich a trade seem to deserve a place in history. The silence of the French historians in this point gives us just cause to suspect the validity of this author's assertions, nor do I find in the history of Portugal, which is so full of the Portuguese discoveries of Negritia and Guinea, the latest mention of their having heard any Frenchman that had founded the castle of Mina in 1383, or that Azambuja, when he came to Mina in 1484 and begun there his first entrenchment, ever saw or heard of any such castle built by the French 100 years before. These reasons seem singularly insufficient for thus summarily dismissing all claims of the French, for according to the accounts of Villot and Robbie, those voyages and settlements were made by private merchants and not, as in the case of the Portuguese, as a national work. It seems most unreasonable to suppose that these independent traders, having at great trouble and danger to themselves discovered and founded a rich and profitable trade in a hitherto unknown country, would have been anxious or even likely to have advertised many particulars, but far more probable that they would have been content with congratulating themselves on their good fortune and have endeavored by every means in their power to keep it to themselves. A manufacturer at the present day who discovers a new and lucrative process does not immediately make a present of it to all his rivals, but on the contrary, takes every precaution to keep it secret. There are comparatively simple means of effecting this now, but in former times silence was the only safeguard, even as it is still the best. The absence of any mention of this trade by the French historians is not, therefore, very remarkable. The fact that no French fort is mentioned by any Portuguese historian is equally inconclusive. These writers were dependent for their information on those who went to the coast with Diego d'Azambuja's expedition, and if they, going out to found a settlement, suddenly discovered the existence of a fort built by another European nation long before the date of those discoveries of their own race in which they took such pride, it would be only in accordance with human nature, perhaps if they decided to say nothing about it, but to keep all the credit for themselves, rather than nullify the glory of all those expeditions that had cost them so much. As against this possibility, it may be argued that the Portuguese would never have permitted a name or inscription pointing to such a previous occupation to have remained in existence during all the time that they were in undisputed possession. But though this seems to be a sound argument, it is nevertheless a well-known fact that such careless mistakes are very frequently made, and the name Bastion de France might have been perpetuated by the Elminas themselves, and not by the Portuguese at all. The inscription also amounted to so little that it might easily have been overlooked or its defacement deferred until in the end it was forgotten, or again, it may actually have been defaced, but the work badly done. The existence on the coast of places bearing French names at the time of Villot's voyage is, however, of very little importance. Such names were probably given by the Rouen Company, which had settlements on the Grain Coast in 1616, only 50 years before he wrote, but were afterwards abandoned. On the other hand, in favor of this claim, Villot distinctly states that he himself saw the ruins of the French fort at Tacarady, upon which the Swedes had subsequently erected a fort which in turn was then in ruins, and saw at Elmina a fair church still in being, adorned with the monuments and arms of France. He was also shown at Commenda the remains of the old French factory at the northern end of the town, and received a message from the chief informing him that he had refused the flag that had been sent him by the Dutch general Willemberg at Elmina, on the ground that his country had always belonged to the French, and that no other nation would be welcomed in it. the Portuguese and Dutch writers also complain of the damage done by the French to their trade, and the preference of the people showed for them. The chief interest in this dispute, however, centers around the inscription in the Bastion de France. As has already been remarked, and as might reasonably be expected, the French make mention of these things, while the Portuguese, on the other hand, are silent on the subject. They were both interested parties, and Villot, as has been stated, did not write until 1666 and does not quote any authorities for his assertions. It is interesting, therefore, to note what a third party, writing at a not much later date, has to say on the subject. Dapper, a Dutchman, published a description of this coast in 1686, less than 50 years after the expulsion of the Portuguese from Elmina, of which he gives one of the best accounts. He says, "Some years ago the Dutch restored a battery which is called the French Battery, because according to the general opinion of the natives of the place, the French were masters of it before the Portuguese. There is engraved on a stone the first two figures of the number 1300, but it is impossible to decipher the last two others." It had another inscription also carved on a stone between two pillars in a small room inside the fort, but it was all obliterated. He goes on to say that there was another inscription over the door of the warehouse in the castle, setting forth that it was built in 1484 under John II of Portugal, and that the figures of this date were so little worn that they might only have been carved 9 or 10 years, and consequently the others must be assumed to be of great age. Farther on, he describes how after the expulsion of the Portuguese, the Dutch restored the ruined battery which held the outworks of the castle, and is said to defend the shore battery and river, and that as the soldiers in this battery could not pass into the castle, except by 2 flights of close on 40 steps, the soldiers' lodgings were lowered by about 5 foot, and a long gallery constructed all around from the sea to the new bastion. Now, if the figures in an inscription over the door of a warehouse where they would be exposed to the inclemency of the weather only appeared to be about 10 years old after the lapse of a couple of centuries, it is absolutely inconceivable, even after allowing for possible differences in the quality of the stone, that another inscription in a sheltered position in a room inside the fort should have been so defaced by time alone as to have become quite ineligible after a period of only 100 years longer. Consequently, great support is lent by this statement to the theory that there really was a French fort in existence at Elmina when the Portuguese arrived there under Desembuja, and that in order to conceal this evidence of priority, they defaced the inscriptions, but did not perform this act of vandalism and deceit sufficiently thoroughly to prevent a part of the date of one of them being still decipherable. And further, that the ruins of this old building were subsequently restored and incorporated with the castle by the Dutch. Labat, writing in 1728, alleges that there existed among the archives of Dieppe a deed of association between the merchants of Dieppe and those of Rouen to carry on the trade to West Africa. This deed was dated 1365, but was destroyed in the fire which consumed the town hall in 1694, and consequently could not be produced in evidence. Such is the evidence now available on this disputed point, which it must be admitted is somewhat inconclusive and meagre. But though it may be impossible at this date to decide with certainty whether the French had established themselves in Elmina before the arrival of the Portuguese or not, it is equally out of the question altogether to ignore the claims of the former nation. The account of the formation of the Portuguese settlement has therefore been given first, merely because there is no doubt that it occurred, and because it is the one of which we now possess the fullest particulars, and not because the French account is considered apocryphal or in any way deserving of ready dismissal.